Hello, everyone, and thanks for attending today's webcast, Cybersecurity, Mainstreaming the Mainframe. Before we begin today's presentation, there are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to address. For an optimal viewing experience, please ensure that you have checked system requirements along with bandwidth considerations. If you have technical difficulties, please click on the help link located via the question mark widget at the bottom left of your screen, where you will find details about system requirements and frequently asked questions. If you experience a blank screen during the webcast, please try refreshing your browser or pressing F5. To maximize the slide area, click on the full screen mode icon at the top right corner of the slide area. To ask questions during today's presentation, please type your questions into the Q&A widget and hit submit. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Also, notice the Learn More widget. Here, we've added a link to the next webcast in our Did You Know series on September 28th. Tips, tricks, and other aha moments using Expediter with Topaz Workbench. A copy of today's slide presentation, as well as a link to a recently published blog post. Stay ahead of insider threats to mainframe systems. If you like what you read, don't miss out. Make sure you take a moment to subscribe to the Inside Tech Talk to get the latest mainframe news and insights delivered to your inbox weekly. We also encourage everyone to fill out the survey before today's end of the presentation, and by submitting your response, you will automatically be entered to win a $50 American Express gift card. There will be 3 lucky winners selected from today's respondents. We are extremely pleased today to have as our speakers Compuware Account Consultant Mike Bassett and Product Manager John Crossno. With that, I'd now like to welcome and hand things over to John. John?
Thank you, Janet. So we're really addressing 2 different industry issues that are closely related. The first has to do with the growing cybersecurity risks. We see an ever-increasing number of breaches. In 2014 to 2015, it was a 5% increase. In 2016, an interesting note here is that there were more than 4 billion records stolen, and that was double the numbers from the prior 2 years. As part of the finding the insider threat in that cybersecurity risk box is interesting is the amount of time it actually takes to find that insider threat, to detect that you've been breached. The global average for that is 146 days. And just for EMEA, out of the same report, EMEA was 469 days. So this really shows the importance of monitoring what's going on in your system and who's accessing what, really to be able to detect, earlier whether your system's been breached or not. The other side of this issue really has to do with data privacy and the increasing compliance mandates from the various regulatory organizations. Right? In the States, here we have HIPAA and PCI and such. Europe has GDPR, although that's not just a European mandate. If your organization is doing any business with a resident of Europe, so someone living in Europe, regardless of their citizenship or nationality, then your organization also falls under those GDPR requirements. So really, you need mechanisms to control, monitor, and report who's accessing what data. It's really about the private data, the sensitive data. And that requires an automated way of notifying when you've detected a breach and who to notify. Because the owners of that data, right, the customers, are the ones that need to be notified that their data was taken. So if we look at the cost of cybersecurity, involved with cybersecurity attacks, first are the 60% of attacks are by insiders. And when we say insiders, we're really referring to people with credentials to be in the system, employees, contractors, other third parties that have access to your systems. So last year, the average cost of a breach was $3.8 million per case. But we saw one just recently in the last couple of days with a bank, and there was a claim of that it cost them something of in the order of $300 million. So we're really looking at averages here on this slide, but you can see that the numbers can dramatically increase depending on the type of data that is taken and over what period that breach was occurring. If you're actively monitoring for that, however you're doing that, the idea is that the time that the breach is that you've been breached, that somebody is in your system, is really going to be lowered because you're going to be able to find them sooner. And if you're finding them sooner, the idea is that they're really gathering less data, causing less damage, and thus the cost will then decrease as well.
Okay, so let's talk about the problem that we're dealing with as a result, right? So everyone pretty much knows that sensitive data and business critical systems, most of them sit on the mainframe platform. And we all know that the mainframe is inherently a very highly secure platform as well. But there's a problem that exists. And a lot of information security specialists understand that they may lack some visibility into the behavior of what we call the authorized users. And so basically, there's two groups of users that we're talking about when it comes to the authorized user. And that is those users that John has already mentioned, they have appropriate credentials and access, right, permissions, let's say, to those applications and data that reside on the mainframe. But there's a second set of users that make up a group of people that have somehow, in some nefarious way, come into possession of the credentials of those authorized users. And those particular people are people that are taking on the identity of those authorized users and getting into those applications and being able to see the data that they normally wouldn't have access to. All right. The second part of that problem is that most organizations are reliant on their users and or outsourcers that have those credentials to access that information, and they're the ones that may actually be committing the crime, right? Taking that data, passing it on to the competition, or taking that data, selling it on the street, or actually using that data for their own personal gain. One other item of note is that this pertains to all systems, right? This isn't just something that pertains to the mainframe platform. So what are organizations doing today to try to gain more visibility into those patterns of behavior with regard to accessing this information on the mainframe? Well, today there are things such as SMS data, and this is data that is logged on the mainframe related to many of the various processes that are running on the mainframe at any given time. They contain information, obviously, that highlights events that have occurred on the system, right? There are also scans of disparate logs that are utilized from specific processes that run on the mainframe platform. Again, those are things that will identify various events that have occurred with those particular processes. Theme tools are one way that the information security specialists use to actually pull all these various data sources together in order to do analysis and try to understand what kinds of patterns may be present so that they can start to get an idea of the types of patterns that may indicate something that's leading up to a potential breach or a breach has occurred. Of course, on any platform, especially on the mainframe, they're utilizing the security platform within the system, such as RACF, ACF2, or Top Secret, to basically set in place appropriate security controls that only allow certain individuals to have certain access to various resources on the platform. All right. And then finally, active monitoring solutions are yet another way in which the information security specialist is going to try to, again, be a little bit more proactive in terms of having something that will give them more insight much more quickly in terms of any types of patterns that may be occurring with regard to behavior and activity that they're seeing on the system. And John, I know you had some things to add to this point.
Yeah, so when you think of active monitoring solutions, these are the products that are looking real time at things going on in the system. You know, looking real time at some of the SMF data, looking at potentially, you know, is someone changing an ACE control block in a RACF, you know, in RACF for a user. So they're looking at different aspects of things. What they're not able to do though is actually see what the user's seeing, right? Drill down to that level of granularity. It's really a lot of stuff up at the system level, which in a lot of cases is necessary, and if certain patterns emerge, you know, they can block access to things. But it takes a long time for those patterns to emerge, and you can wind up with a lot of false positives then still. So we have Application Audit from Compuware, and it's really changing how we're going to be looking at mainframe cybersecurity and compliance together, right? By looking at real-time user behavior, or capturing the user behavior, user activities in real time, and making that information available to an analytics engine or a SIM or SIEM, your flavor, for further analysis, right? And figuring out what's really going on and looking at it from a user behavior analytics perspective. So we'll start out with looking at the result. All right, here is some data that has been collected on a system or multiple systems and has been made available to Splunk, and this is a sample Splunk dashboard. It's pretty generic in nature, but it lets us look at various aspects of things going on in the system without getting into, you know, specifics or uniqueness about any, you know, any particular shop. So it really just keeps it generic. The first row there talks about over the last 24 hours or 7 days or 30 days. The last row really talks about the number of users on an LPAR. And while that itself isn't interesting, we can drill down and look at a subset or a deeper drill on that data and really look at the top 20 used Apple IDs on that LPAR and the least 20 used Apple IDs. And the top 20 used Apple IDs is interesting because we have the data and then we can show that, and it's interesting to see which applications or which Apple IDs are being used the most. But from a security standpoint, as well as an operational standpoint, it's the least 20 that become interesting. You might not recognize the Apple ID that's being presented, being shown, and so you'll want to then drill down and see, well, what users are in that Apple ID that I don't recognize? Where did it come from? Or maybe even it's an Apple ID and, you know, you've migrated all the users off to somewhere else and it's still running, it's still available, and there's still users in there. And why is that, right? But if there's only a couple of users in an Apple ID and it's one that you might not recognize, could that be an indication that somebody has accessed your system, using valid credentials, and how they got those credentials could have been through phishing exercises, black market acquisition. It could be an employee, right? And they're running an application and they're accessing that, and maybe there's only one or two users in there, and so you have to wonder, why are there so few users in that application? And so it starts to raise some questions and things that you can drill down into, looking a little deeper at the data to see who they are and what they're really doing. The next row really deals more directly with security, and in this example, we're looking for things appearing on the screen, say in a CICS transaction, where somebody is typing in a transaction ID that's not valid. And so CICS is going to return transaction not recognized. So we're really, in this example, looking for not recognized. We're also looking for, if they're in TSO, typing in TSO commands, getting invalid or not recognized TSO commands, they're going to get command whatever it is not found. So those are the two strings in this example that we're looking for based on what the user was seeing on the screen. We're looking for not recognized and not found. And we'll drill down a little deeper into that, and we'll see that we have the top 20 users with invalid transactions. And in this case, most employees, application users, are familiar with the application. They're familiar with the transaction IDs they might have to enter to use that system. Or in the case of TSO, they're going to probably be familiar with TSO commands if they're in TSO, right? And so if you start to see a user ID with an increased number of invalid transactions or commands not found, that raises some questions into, well, what's that user doing? Are they snooping around in that CICS region looking for something? Is it a real user, right? It could be someone that has the credentials and is doing something. It could just be that user being nosy and maybe needs some education. Maybe they're new. But in any case, it could indicate abnormal behavior. It's an abnormal situation to be looking at. Then we get, we'll look at that same data from the perspective of the top 20 users with invalid transactions by terminals. Your typical user in this example, they'll start up their emulator, they'll get a terminal ID dynamically assigned to them, and they'll log on and they'll do their work and they'll work for the day. And some users might reboot their PCs or restart their emulators. Maybe they'll have a couple of different terminal IDs through the normal 24-hour period that we're looking at here. But if you're getting user IDs that are having a large number of terminal IDs assigned, then it's another question that gets raised about, should we be looking deeper at what they're doing? Why are they getting, why are they using so many terminal IDs? Is it somebody running a script or multiple scripts, and each one is using, say, TN3270 protocol and connecting, and each one is getting its own terminal ID, and they're doing lots of these? Could it be an indication that you have a breach, right? So these are just some things that we collect, information we collect, and we decided to use in this demo just to provide some generic examples that, can be found on everybody's system. So then the last two rows really talk about the time on the system, how much time has a user spent, and if we were to drill down into that third row, we would see users that spend some number of hours on the system, totally for a day. And in a 24-hour period, you wouldn't expect a user to necessarily accrue more than 10 or 12 hours, normal users, unless they're really dedicated employees, in a single system. And if you start to see users with more than that, and approaching 18, 20, even close to 24 hours, then that might be an indication as well that you've been breached. So that was an example of the type of data that we're collecting, things that we can look at. Obviously, the information on the screen is dependent on your applications, and you're going to want to be looking at other things or have the ability to look at other things and other patterns. Are they looking at the same patient number over and over and over again, or the same credit card number? Are they looking at it in a pattern that is abnormal to the other people in using that application? Those are types of things to be looking at that we can provide. If you're looking just at log files, SMF records, you may see that they accessed the file or they accessed a database or even a table. You can't see exactly what they were looking at. So here we'll get into simplifying auditing on the mainframe, and Mike is going to walk you through some examples there of how to set that up and do that.
Thanks, John. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to, now that John's shown you the outcome of the analysis, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how easy it is to set up the process for collecting that data so that you can bring it down into your scene tool for your analysis. All right. So what we're looking at right now is the main menu of the application audit user interface. This is a browser-based interface, which is very easy to set up in the system so that your information security people can easily bring that up in a browser. Of course, it's secured through Mainframe Security, so the access to this can be limited to only those folks that need to have access to it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take you into the first selection here, which is the record function, right? This is the primary function where you're going to create your request. So when that initial screen comes up to add the request, you're going to simply go ahead and enter a name that identifies this request uniquely. And it can be update characters, whatever you want it to be. And then you can also enter a description that gives a little bit more text defining what it is for. There are three tabs in the middle of the screen here, okay? And the initial target tab is what comes up. And you're going to basically select the type of data you want to collect. In this case, we've already selected 3270, or otherwise known as green screen activity, to be recorded. Of course, that pull down also allows you to select TCP/IP or MQ data as well. Down below that, you'll see in the area highlighted as activity, you'll be able to basically enter both what we call include and exclude filters, okay? You can enter any number of these, and what this allows you to do is add some level of granularity in terms of the type of information you want to collect, right? So in this case, the first exclude entry there pertains to a particular terminal ID that we don't have any interest in collecting. And then the second line, the include there, is specifically targeting a VTAM application which happens to be a CICS region. And it also targets a specific set of user IDs starting with that value that is wildcarded in the user column. Okay. Again, you can enter any number of these include, exclude filters in order to cause the appropriate type of data to be collected for your particular purpose. All right. Once you do that, you click on the Dataset tab, and that will allow us to come in and set some very unique criteria for how the recording request will handle what we call switching of the data repositories that the collected data is stored in. You can choose to have a daily switch schedule by clicking on the switch to turn it on, and then specifying a start and end time frame, and then selecting from the pull-down the time interval in which you want that data to be made available for pushing down to your SIEM tool for analysis, right? And in this case, we said we want to set up the schedule for 24 hours, and we want the switch to be every 30 minutes, okay? Setting this up this way for a request can be very handy, particularly if for some reason what you're recording happens to be something that is very critical or very sensitive, in that you want to be able to have that data brought into the SIEM very quickly for analysis so that you can determine if there's any activity that you need to be concerned about, right? So that's a very handy capability that you might want to consider turning on for particular requests. You may not want to turn it on for all because switching does occur naturally when the data set fills up, and then obviously it's closed and a new data set is open to continue collecting the data. Now, sometimes there may be a conflict when a repository data set is found to exist already, and the recording request goes to allocate that same data set. A decision has to be made by the process to determine, should I cancel the recording or should I delete that data set so I can allocate the new one and continue recording the data? In most cases, that situation is very unique, and most people will assume that that data set, if it existed at one time, had already been processed in the past, and they'll prefer to have that data set deleted because they do not want to lose any of the current activity that's being recorded by that recording request. And so most people will select delete data set. Okay. So next, we'll select the SIEM tab. And on here, this is where you can tell Application Audit that I want you to push this data down to my SIEM tool, whether it's Splunk or some other tool. All right, and so you just simply switch it on. And then, of course, our recommendation always is to ensure that you, if there's any type of error that occurs in pushing that data down to the SIEM, that you have the option to turn on an automatic email notification to go to a specific person that will tell them that, hey, listen, there was a problem pushing the data down to the SIEM. You need to look at this issue. So we always recommend that you turn that notification on just to make sure that that data gets pushed down to the SIEM on a regular basis without any issues. Okay. Now, once you do that, you can go ahead and click on the recording icon in the upper right there, and it will add the request, and the application audit will begin recording the data according to your criteria that you specified in the request. Okay. So now what I'm going to show you is the second option off of the main application audit menu, and that is the manage recordings option. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to go in and review both your active and your inactive recording requests. Okay. By default, it comes up with the active tab showing all of the active recording requests that you have running on your system. Okay, and it provides information related to each one of those in terms of when they are started, when the last segment of your data repository was created, gives you the data set, the base data set name as well, in case you want to go out and review what data sets exist out there as well. But it also allows you to do various things with a specific entry. When you select an entry, you are able to stop the recording. You're able to clone the recording in case you want to create a new recording request where there's similar criteria that you want to use, but you want to make some alterations to some of the data because it's slightly different. And so that makes it easier for you to add a new request and start recording for that. It also allows you to remove a request or delete a request and put it in the inactive list in case, there's no need for you to continue recording that data for some reason. Of course, you're able to look at the inactive requests as well by selecting the inactive tab, and that will show you all of those requests that are still out there. They have active repository data sets, and what I mean by that is there's still data associated with that request, but it's not currently active in recording, and that sort of thing. There's some other details that you can look at as well as you look down at the bottom portion or midsection of the screen. There's actually active sessions selection there. When you select an active request, you can actually see the user sessions that are being recorded by the request if you're interested in seeing that detail at that time and that sort of thing. And so this is a very important function in that it allows you to manage those recording requests that you've created.
So at the end of the day, we're really focusing on the insider threat and providing the data that you need to really perform user behavior analytics. It's all about determining, finding those user patterns of behavior that help you find those insider threats. Whether those patterns are evolving over, in a short period of time, or sometimes they take a long time to evolve. If you're not collecting the data at a granular enough level, and possibly combining that information with other data that you're collecting, it makes it really hard to find those insider threats. So the more data you can collect and the more granular you can collect that data, the sooner you'll be able to find those breaches, or even those, if it's an employee, those employees that are misusing their privileges in using applications to access private data.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Mike. Before we start answering your questions, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you again and encourage everyone to fill out the short survey. Again, everyone who responds today will be entered to automatically win a $50 American Express gift card, and there will be 3 lucky winners that will be selected from today's respondents. And with that, I'd now like to start Q&A and hand things over to John.
So the first question was regarding the beginning slide where I talked about the 4 billion records stolen, or more than double the amount of records stolen in 2016 versus 2014 and 15 combined. That information came from IBM's X-Force report that came out in March or May or somewhere around there of this year. I don't recall, the question was what percentage of theft was from inside versus outside breaches. The report kind of talks about all sorts of the breaches, so both. It doesn't break down the 4 billion, though, specifically into a percentage of one versus the other. It kind of talks throughout the report of all the different sorts, and then, in the summary it talks about the 4 billion or the double 2015 and 2016 numbers. So feel free to, look at the IBM X-Force site and pull that report. It's always a good report to be looking at. The next question has to do with product overhead. So what is the overhead associated with collecting this information and running this process? The technology that we're using to capture the information we've had in use in another product for quite some time. There's very, very little overhead involved with running this, capturing this information. And we have some customers that are collecting a lot of data. They record absolutely everything that's going on, and there's little overhead. They've never complained about any overhead, and we've not measured any significant overhead involved with this. So. And then let's see. The next question is there a limit on the number of filters? We didn't talk about the filters when we export data from our product to a theme where you can or to an analytics engine where you can perform that function. We can filter that information. Some people don't want everything getting sent out to the theme. For example, in the case of Splunk, right? Splunk charges by ingest volume, and so they want to limit the amount of data going there. They might also want to limit the amount of data going to just that, of the record that they need they want for analytics. There is no architected limit to the number of filters, and so to the best of my knowledge, there is no limit. We've not had a customer report a limit to us, and we know of some customers that have several thousand filters going at one time. Obviously, there is a little bit of processing time involved with the filters. The more you have, the more they have to parse through that. But there's no known limits, or at least no limits that I'm aware of.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more. So
here's one. What SIMs does your tool integrate with today, and do you plan to expand that to others in the marketplace? So we will work with a number of SIMs, either directly that we write to those directly ourselves, or through partners. One thing we didn't want to do is there are some other products in the market that do a really good job of collecting data from the mainframe and making that available to a number of SIMs. And we partner with those as we do, in Compuware for a lot of other things. We look for partners that are efficient in what they do and really take it from the mainframe to that next step. That way customers aren't, requiring multiple products really to do the same function, right? Why should we reinvent the wheel? So anyway, the SIMs that we do support are Splunk, HP ArcSight, IBM's QRadar. We can get to CoreLog. Hadoop is supported. So either we're doing it directly ourselves, or it's through one of our partners. And our partners in this case are SyncSort with their IronStream product, and CoreLog with their CoreLog for Z product, which they also have a SIM themselves in addition to being able to provide that data to other SIMs as well.
I think we can take one more before we have to wrap up.
Okay. Is there a limit to the volume of user activity that can be collected? No. As I said, we have some of the largest VOS shops in the world using this solution, using this recording technology, and they have never ran into a problem with the volume of user activity that can be collected, and they generate a lot of data. So there's none that we've been made aware of.
Great. I think we're going to have to wrap it up and be considerate of everybody's time. I want to thank everybody for logging into the webcast today. For those who might have had some technical difficulties, we definitely will be sending out a replay of the webcast afterwards. And for those questions that we didn't have time to answer today, we will definitely reach out directly as well. Thanks again, everyone, for attending today's webcast. This concludes our presentation. Have a